My name is Aleks Pluskowski. I'm a professor of medieval archaeology at the University of Reading. I've been here for over 15 years now, and I teach medieval archaeology and also zooarchaeology, which is the study of animal bones, which are one of the most common finds you get on archaeological sites anywhere in the world from any time period. But right now I'm involved in leading a major research project, and I've been leading research projects for many years. I started off as a student in Cambridge a long time ago and completed my PhD there on the wolf in medieval Northern Europe, on human responses to wolves and their environment, the wilderness, on either side of a conversion to Christianity. So the things that I've been interested in have been the role of religion in driving human behavior in the past, and particularly the environmental dimensions of that. So in other words, do attitudes to the natural world, to animals, to plants, to landscapes change with changes in ideology, changes in religion, changes in worldview, changes in values? And I've particularly applied that to the study of medieval Europe in its broader sense, and especially the study of frontier societies. So we can say the geographic edges of Christian Europe, Catholic Europe, shall we say, in the medieval period, in the broader medieval period. So of course it depends where in Europe you are, the time frames vary, and different social processes take place at different times. I worked in many regions of Europe. I've excavated widely around Europe and also beyond. I've been working in the Western Indian Ocean for many years as well, in Mauritius, on similar questions, but dealing with the post-medieval era, the colonial era. And I've led projects predominantly in Eastern Europe, in the Baltic, focusing on the impact of the Baltic Crusades on the environment of what is today Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, northern Poland, and the Russian Kaliningrad Oblast. And I ran a European Research Council project there for several years, where we accumulated a lot of data looking at basically the most important social, cultural transformation that transformed the Baltic world in the medieval period, with these crusades, these campaigns that saw these regions transformed from, shall we say, as the Christians called them, pagan, small-scale pagan societies, small scale in terms of political organization, into Catholic territories, Catholic polities, that then persisted through into the modern period, right through in some cases, as in the case of Prussia, into the Second World War. And I've also worked a lot in northern Italy, in the Adriatic, on the Venetian lagoon, with a team led by Professor Sarah Jellicky of Ca' Foscari University, where we looked at similar questions, essentially exploring how Venetian expansion and colonization of the Adriatic transformed the environment, and vice versa, and how Venice became dependent on its environments at the same time. Primarily from a zooarchaeological perspective, so looking at the exploitation of animals, but within their broader environmental context. And then more recently, and by more recently, I think the last 7 or 8 years, I've been working in Spain, particularly, looking at similar questions. So here, the frontier between Christian and Muslim territories, polities. So in other words, Al-Andalus, the Islamic Iberian polity that is created in the 8th century, the early 8th century, following the Arab-Berber conquests from North Africa and the introduction of Islam, the end of the Visigothic kingdoms. And I've been looking at this with Spanish colleagues, with Spanish teams, from a cultural landscape perspective. So looking at how the landscape changed as this political religious frontier was created and reformed. Eventually you have these conquests against Al-Andalus led by northern Christian territories that push the frontier all the way down and eventually absorb the entire peninsula by the year 1492. So that encompasses the entirety of what we call the Middle Ages in Iberia. And most recently, I've become involved in a much bigger consortium project that involves 4 principal teams looking at the impact, the environmental impact of population movements and political changes across a 1,000-year time span across the Western Mediterranean. So not just the Iberian Peninsula, but also the Balearic Islands and the fringes of North Africa. And all of these are one cultural zone in the early medieval period and through into parts of the later medieval period, what we call the medieval millennium. So this is the biggest project I've been involved in so far. It involves some 50 or more researchers spread across multiple institutions in Spain primarily, also in the UK and in Morocco. And we've been looking at the environment from every possible perspective. So I started off as an animal bone specialist, but I've become over time someone who manages teams of environmental specialists, including those who study the soils and the sediments, looking for chemical traces of human activity, animal activity associated with that, but also changes in vegetation on the basis of things like pollen, plant macrofossils that we find at archaeological sites, the remains of food production, food preparation, and also genetic and isotopic evidence associated with both plants and animals, as well as things like extraction of metals and minerals from the landscape, from outcrops, from quarries. So really what we're trying to do is a total environmental archaeology and history of the Western Mediterranean, associated with, firstly, population movements from North Africa and then population movements from northern Iberia and southern France into the southern parts of the Iberian Peninsula. So these are the sorts of questions I'm interested in. In many cases, the societies that I've been studying have been connected with the crusading movement, which appears at the end of the 11th century. It's a creation of the papacy, the Catholic leadership of medieval Europe, and it's essentially a penitential war where you can swear a vow in exchange for the remission of your sins. So to die having taken a crusader oath on the battlefield would be a complete remission of sins in the minds of medieval Catholics. So it was very appealing from a spiritual perspective, and it became a pan-European movement that really drove conquest and colonization at the fringes of Europe, most famously, of course, in the Levant, in what was called the Holy Land, with the conquest of Jerusalem and the establishment of Crusader states at the end of the 11th, beginning of the 12th century. But then this became extended to parts of Eastern Europe, specifically the Baltic, so what I was referring to earlier in terms of the Baltic Crusades, but also parts of northern Germany against Slavic pagan groups living there, what became known as the Wendish Crusade, and later conquests associated with the colonization of Slavic lands by German marcher lords and their retinues. And then also in other parts of the Mediterranean, so in the southwest in Iberia, the Christian conquests of Islamic Al-Andalus are sometimes framed as crusading campaigns, and the whole process eventually became framed as a sort of an ongoing religious conflict. So all the societies that I study in Europe have this in common, that they're driven by religious ideology, but the processes themselves, conquest, regime change, colonization, settlement change, the reorganization of the political landscape, all of this sees the reorganization of natural resources and how the natural world is exploited and dealt with, and also how it's thought about. And so this is the lens that I look at, if you like, these various processes. And these can be applied really to any frontier society, any place where you have some form of hostile takeover, a military conquest, followed by the establishment of new settlements, colonies, as a subjugation of a local population if it survives, and the establishment of protocols of environmental exploitation that follow. And I've been doing this a little bit in the Indian Ocean world as well, where we've been looking at environmental exploitation following the impact of colonial rule, so Dutch, French, and then British colonial rule, particularly on Mauritius, which had a profound impact on the island's ecosystems, dramatically and completely changing them as a result of human colonization, but also as a result of different layers of colonial rule and then, of course, independence. So this is something that I'll be continuing into the foreseeable future, looking at different regions and getting a better sense of what we share as a species in terms of how we exploit our environments, and particularly how we do them under stress. So all of the regions I've been looking at, of course, we've got climatic fluctuations in the background, the Baltic Crusades and the southern conquests of Islamic Iberia took place during what is known as the end of the medieval warm period, the beginning of the Little Ice Age, which roughly begins at points in the 13th century where you have increasing drops in temperature and also increasing aridity in the Mediterranean. It varies in Northern Europe. But what we see really is human resilience in the face of these climatic fluctuations and a reorganization of how resources are exploited. Of course, this also has impacts on the capacity for humans to exploit their environments, and the sort of the low points of these climatic deteriorations in terms of temperature and rainfall are really later on in this, we can say, the 16th, 17th centuries. But nonetheless, climate forms an important backdrop. So for the current project, we're working with a team in Switzerland, in Basel, who are reconstructing climatic variables across the Western Mediterranean for us, because one of the things we want to look at is the nuances. So how microclimates play a role, and can this explain variation in human behavior from even one valley to the next? So we're really taking that granular approach to looking at human exploitation of past environments, working with local case studies. So we're working at multi-scalar levels, from individual villages, political centers, high status sites, through to much bigger macro regions where we've got clusters of villages, clusters of settlements, through to the full societal level, and seeing how we can use environmental data, paleoenvironmental data, to reconstruct social trends in the past. So this serves as a really valuable lens alongside the other archaeological proxies that we use, such as ceramics, metal artifacts, debris from construction, building materials, and the structures themselves. So there's a lot of different proxies that we use to understand human behavior in the past. But environmental data, which is quite broad, as I said earlier on, in terms of the types of what we call ecofacts that you can obtain from an archaeological site, from an excavation, or from sampling depositional basins like lakes, peat bogs. You can extract environmental data that will give you a record of the local environment, in our case over the last 1,000, 2,000 years. That's the time period that we're interested in. And you can reconstruct that usually to quite a specific level. It's much more difficult, much broader with longer time periods where you're dealing with bigger margins of error, broader date ranges. But when you're talking about the medieval period or the Roman period, or any historical period, then you're dealing with a much higher resolution. You have written sources as well. So for the current project, we're working with numerous historians who are looking at the fragmentary written sources that have our own problems, but also have a higher resolution, usually than archaeological data when it comes to chronology. And so piecing all these different types of data together are one of the challenges, one of the fun elements of working with a historical period where you have disparate forms of data giving you perspectives, giving you witnesses essentially from different points of view at different scales. And it's incredibly challenging. It's the only kind of work that really can be done with a team. So it's unusual to find archaeologists working by themselves, unless we're talking about specialists working with very particular bodies of data. But specialists tend to work within a team, answering research questions, working towards bigger objectives that involve a lot more people. So this is the nature of archaeological research today. It is extensive. It needs a lot of funding because, particularly when using a lot of scientific archaeology, you need a lot of money for laboratory analysis, but also entails working with historians, with architects, with art historians, with linguists. And so the biggest projects tend to be very multidisciplinary, but working towards the same goals, trying to answer the same questions. So in the case of a project I'm currently involved in, this will end in 4 years' time. So we've got a lot of work to do. And by the end of that time, we'll have a much better understanding of how people shaped the environments of Western Mediterranean over a 1,000-year time span. And if we're lucky, we'll get some insights into how those innovations and challenges can be used to inform the future, because we expect to see aridity, increasing aridity and water shortages in the future in that part of the world. And it's something that people faced in the past. So maybe there are technologies, approaches to the landscape that we can understand in the past that can help us to understand how to deal with these challenges in the future, where we're going to see a lot of problems connected with water especially, and with aridity. So that is also one thing that we can learn from the past if we want to, is to look at how people dealt with environmental challenges and how they overcame them or not, or how they failed, and what lessons we can learn from failure, where societies didn't completely vanish, because societies never do, but they dwindled in terms of population. People migrated away, created new societies. This is usually what we understand in terms of a sort of catastrophic decline. We don't really understand it in terms of civilizations just collapsing overnight, but we do understand it in terms of people leaving. Maybe there are also things like pandemics that result in a decrease in the population, but we're talking here about human resilience and people reinventing themselves, recreating societies, and obviously the environment plays an important role in this. Population movements have played a significant role in all of the frontiers that I've looked at, of course, in terms of colonization and warfare. And I think these are questions that are pertinent for the future as well, and how we as a species will deal with the environmental challenges that we will face in the coming decades and centuries. So I've published multiple books and articles on the various aspects of my work. A lot of my early publications were on animals and human-animal relations, the impact of on animals in medieval societies in terms of different ideologies and approaches to managing the environment. More recently, though, I've been publishing on these frontier societies, and particularly on the crusading dimensions. So one of the things that I teach here in Reading is the archaeology of crusading that is connected with the material traces of these various frontier societies that were shaped by the crusading movement. So I've talked about these before in the corners, shall we say, the geographic corners of Europe. And I wrote this book, The Archaeology of the Prussian Crusade. This is the second edition, published a few years ago, really because there was very little written in English on this topic. And this is a common theme actually on all of these frontier societies. Though in the case of the Baltic Crusades, there's obviously a lot written in Polish and Lithuanian, Estonian, Latvian, the Scandinavian languages, and Russian, a lot in German from the early archaeology of the region, but very little in English. So I created the first synthetic work with this book, really to help my students get a handle on the topic because of the lack of access to these various languages and the literature associated with them. But it's really become the first synthetic work on this topic in any language. And so I think it's also a useful research synthesis that's been used widely for those who are interested in the archaeology of the Prussian Crusade, which is just this region today within the boundaries of northeastern Poland, Russian Kaliningrad, the Oblast, and southwestern Lithuania. So just a small region, but a very significant region when it comes to understanding past societies. And the main agent of this change in the region that I've written a lot about recently is called the Teutonic Order, or the Teutonic Knights, who are a military order, a Catholic knightly order, like the Templars and the Hospitallers that you may be more familiar with, but German-speaking, and one that comes to dominate the conquests and the governance of conquered lands in northeastern Europe. So this is another recent book I was asked to write, which is The Teutonic Knights, The Rise and Fall of a Religious Corporation. This is really just an introduction to the Teutonic Order, the medieval Teutonic Order, because the institution continued after the medieval period and continues into the present day as a charitable branch of the Catholic Church. But again, this group has seen more work in English, in international languages, shall we say, since the 1990s. But there's still relatively little compared to other languages, especially German. There's been a strong body of scholarship in German throughout the 20th centuries that continues into the present day. So I was asked this to create a more accessible work for an English-speaking audience on this principal group, this religious corporation that dominated the Baltic Crusades and then the rule of the Baltic in the medieval period, the Eastern Baltic and the Southeastern Baltic. So I've been writing more on these. And I've got another book coming out early next year, which is a new history of the Baltic Crusades that will be published by Yale University Press. And again, it's an attempt to bring to an English language audience, an international audience, the history of the entirety of the Baltic that was affected by the crusading movement, which is large swathes of it, but essentially in large parts of Northern Europe, the entirety of the Baltic world were involved in creating the societies that laid the foundations for the modern Baltic societies we have today. So those are my recent works. I've been publishing on the Spanish project as well. So we've got another book coming out at the end of this year that looks at the landscapes of medieval frontiers in Spain and also southeastern France, Pyrenean France, where we had the Albigensian Crusade, another crusading episode, but a very brutal one that saw the southern part of France, southeastern part of France, what is today France, incorporated into the French kingdom. Previously, it was a series of independent and semi-independent territories. So again, a sort of historical event in the history of Europe, in the history of state formation, a particularly brutal event of conquest that we looked at from a landscape perspective. So that book, called The Landscapes of Reconquest, will be out at the end of this year. And then in this new project that's been running now for a couple of years, looking at the broader environmental changes, we'll have a lot more publications coming out and then books over the next 4 to 5 years as we gather data and interpret our data. So there's a lot of stuff coming out, less so on animals, which was my initial focus, but more so on the broader archaeology and history of these frontier societies that I've been working on for the last couple of decades now.